the exact dynamics of the anti-clockwise vowel shift. I mentioned in another video, when I was a kid, obviously not knowing anything about phonetics, I couldn't have described it very well, but I noticed that the girls around me seemed to pronounce words like dress more like drass, which I think was, I struggle to recreate the exact quality, but something like but I can't.
Mm-hmm.
I'll do a recording where I get it right and then put it in there, but dress. And also more recently I've noticed that fronting and kind of partial monophthongization of the goose vowel to something like goose is something I associate more with women as well. I wondered if you'd had any thoughts about whether certain demographics have more advanced stages of that anti-clockwise shift, or whether you'd consider that kind of goose fronting even to be part of that shift. I think I'll just flip that round so we can see whether it's recording or not.
Yeah, so I'm not a specialist in sociolinguistics and the whole dynamics of everything, but I think it's generally agreed, or widely agreed, that some changes at least seem to be spearheaded by younger female speakers,
Right.
and I think in some cases younger, more middle class female speakers. So the classic examples would include things like uptalk and vocal fry, where you kind of have the rest of the population following behind and maybe having older males at the rear, maybe older working class males at the rear.
This is why a lot of, like the Alton survey, aimed for older males.
Yeah.
Because it was assumed that they would probably have the most conservative dialect features.
Yeah. Ejective, final
click,
like back.
Yeah.
That kind of, not a click exactly. Eject. Clicks are.
Oh, but I meant that click as an example word of click.
Oh, I see. Click. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So I think this happens. I think it happens a lot. Just. Kind of impressionistically, if you think which part of the demographics are more interested in fashion, I mean, who's more interested in fashion? Yeah. Older men or younger women?
That's a very good point.
So I don't think that's ageist or sexist to say that, is it? But it's sort of
I wouldn't have thought so. I think it's just it's like I think I said as well. First of all, that's a good point in terms of where the sound change is picked up first after it, however it starts, which probably has something to do with pushing and pulling influences and stuff that people aren't really aware of. But then how it progresses, I was saying I find myself, if I'm in a situation where I need to be friendly to someone or need to come across as kind of approachable, I'll often catch myself having a more fronted goose vowel than I would normally. So if I'm saying, I've used the example, if I'm saying thank you to like a member of serving staff, the goose vowel will be more fronted than I would normally do it, I think. So I wonder whether it's kind of, people have this impression that younger female speakers are more friendly or something. I don't know, that would be getting into the realm of speculation, but how do you sound friendly by imitating the kind of person you think is friendly or something? But could be, or it could be an association. This is not necessarily a different thing, but an association between conservatism and formality. Oh,
so
okay.
you do the more modern thing when you're being informal. That's
a very good point. I'm trying to think whether there are situations where I'd be speaking informally where I wouldn't do that. I'd have to listen to recordings of myself, because otherwise I'm not conscious of it, I don't think.
I wonder, there might be a lexical component, I'm not sure. I can remember arriving at uni from the north of England going to London, and I remember my very first days in the Hall of Residence. And I think probably probably a majority of my peers were
Yeah.
from the south of England, and being struck by hearing everybody saying really good, really good,
Good.
really good, and why are you talking like that? It just really struck me because, of course, we didn't have YouTube back then. People weren't exposed
really aware of how
to
other
other
people
accents,
spoke, yeah.
from young people all the time. So, this just really struck me. Now, so that's that foot fronting, but lexically specific. So you see, I think it started, you
in
see, in
particular words.
yeah, because I don't think those young students back then were saying football,
No.
and look at this. I don't think they were saying that at all. But I think it seems to have started off with something like really good. And so you've got that, you're talking about, thank you, this a lexical item that's associated with a particular kind of, in that case, being friendly, being warm, being thankful, and this one of approval. Because obviously, if you think about, people are always inventing or coming. There are always new fashions for ways of saying good.
Yeah.
Cool,
Like great,
wicked, and
fantastic,
what
yeah.
you can tell me what the latest ones are.
I'm not sure.
But
Not
all
sure I
that
know.
kind of so words of approval seem to be a place where it's really important to have the latest one, and
that's yeah.
and if you're just those crucial number of years out of date with your
Yeah. Then you sound
with
you
your
come across
groovy or
less
your cool or your whatever it is.
groovy. That's the one everyone's But yeah, I think I've noticed, not in the same, it's not exactly the same situation, but the idea of certain lexical words clustering lexically and certain ones having a more advanced vowel. My friend is into sort of skater culture, and he
Alright.
pronounces the word dude as dude. Dude. I
Dude.
can't really do a very good impression, but I've started to notice his other goose vowel instances dropping gradually into the fronted realisation.
Yeah, and well, you get this lexical dispersion thing.
Yeah.
Changes don't happen, immediately.
All of a sudden.
Yeah, like take for example the near vowel. Go back to my obsessive near vowel. So we can say that it's monophthongizing, but the two lexical items are far more common. Two members of the near set are far more common than any others, and those are here and year. And it's obviously the case if you watch, say, BBC News or something like that, you can see reporters quite a lot older than you saying I'm here or next year, and
Yeah,
got these
yeah.
totally monophthonged vowels in those two words, but not in the rest of their vocabulary.
I'd never noticed that, but would you say that lexical diffusion is how all, because it seems to,
Yeah, and high frequency items could be one, where you get changes early on. That's
early on,
common. Yeah. Certainly, that's a great example because we just know statistically here, year are much more common than the others.
yeah. There's some in, again, I'll have to reference specific examples, but in Lass's Cambridge History of English, well, I don't think he wrote the book, but he wrote the phonology and morphology bit. He's talking about how there are examples of sound changes where you can kind of see lexical diffusion happening in the past, and it's in some cases it seems to have led to phonemicization. So in the foot strut split, for example, I think there's an idea that there was a conditioning factor that had something to do with labial articulation preserving rather than having the new vowel. Obviously they're two separate phonemes in our accent now, and the idea that a sound change gets a certain way through the words that have the right condition and then stops for whatever reason, and then you start to have phonemicization of the two pronunciations as different phonemes. But I really don't know what the minutiae of that would be. Like, at what point does the new oo vowel in dude become a different phoneme to a sort of diphthong, more back diphthong or oo?
So you've got this gradual thing going on, but at the same time there are certain there are certain discrete or abrupt things like generations. So because parents and kids, I mean, there's the difference between a parent and a child is not great. One is one and the other's the other. So you have this new. You've constantly got a new grammar being assembled in the the minds of the young. I mean, with my book, I mean, this idea of saying, well, RP changed. Well, what does that mean exactly? Because they're not exactly the same speakers.
No,
I mean, in this particular case, I mean, obviously you've got this generational factor where you say, oh well, this vowel changed from there to there, but then they weren't the same speakers. Obviously, but also sociologically, in terms of RP, the kinds of people who make up the speakers of, say, what I call standard Southern British today, they're not sociologically the same as classic RP speakers.
That's true.
So it's all slightly, talking about them as being different forms of the same thing is very questionable.
One thing I was thinking about asking you was, and I think I decided not to ask you on the basis that I think it's more of a semantic question than anything else. But I'll say it now because it kind of links into this. I was going to ask, do you think that the Southern Standard British you describe is a descendant of RP? But then I realised, well, how on earth do you quantify what is a descendant of what? It will have been influenced by all kinds of things, kind of dialectal or Cockney.
Yeah, particularly in this case. I mean, this is why I can see why people are shocked a bit when I say it. But this is why I refer to RP in the past tense. There's no value judgment.
No, it's not like this is an
I'm not trying to give it the kiss of death at all. It's not that. My point is, and maybe I'm wrong, but the way I see it, RP, I'll use the past tense, was defined in terms of a certain set of sounds and a certain set of speakers.
Yeah.
And you don't have RP unless you fulfill both of those requirements. So, and Daniel Jones used the term public school pronunciation. So where that's defining it, well, absolutely, in terms of who's speaking it. No, that's the typical thing. I mean, all kinds of people speak French, but generally speaking, French is the language of the French. Generally, so that definition seemed to me to be key for received pronunciation. That if you said over the years, what is received pronunciation? Oh, well, received pronunciation is the English spoken by males educated at the great boarding schools of England, that kind of thing. And you defined socially. Whereas nowadays you have a lot of people thinking of their notion of RP is a set of phoneme symbols. Rather than the speakers. And as I say in the book, Daniel Jones in the First World War gave that public school definition, and then in 1982 the great John Wells in Accents of English did the same again. He said, what is a received pronunciation? Well, it's spoken by, and used public schools as the criterion again. And my point is that you can't say here in the 21st century, I don't think you can possibly say that there is an accent that is a teaching standard characterised by its being spoken by the socioeconomic elite.
I agree.
That there is no such accent. Therefore, in that sense, to me, RP now doesn't exist. It's exactly the same with Cockney. To me, I think Cockney, really, you've got to sort of use it in the past tense.
Right.
Because what's Cockney? Well, it seems to me the classic definition of Cockney is it's the working class accent of London.
But now
that don't work now.
The idea that there's, for one thing, if you took a cross-section of people who are working class, of people who consider themselves working class in London, a relatively small percentage compared to 70 years ago would speak something that resembles Cockney 70 years ago. And also, many people who are not working class or who don't consider themselves working class probably speak things that more closely resemble Cockney than some people that do consider themselves working class. Is that what you mean, kind of thing? It's like there's no cohesive thing that's cladistically.
Well, if you just think in terms
accent.
of what does Cockney mean? What is the meaning of the word? How do you define Cockney in a dictionary or an encyclopedia? What is it?
Yeah.
And it seems to me you're bound to talk about the working classes of London.
Yeah.
And that, but if you're going to do that, it's got to be as was.
Yeah.
I mean, what you can do is you can redefine it in
Yeah.
some complicated way that now includes people in Essex and wherever.
But then that doesn't apply to.
But that's not what people classically think of Cockney as being.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean.
I
The same
do,
applies
yeah,
completely to RP. You can redefine it, and many people do. And they would say, well, they'd say, maybe not me, I'd probably be excluded from the club, but they'd
Right.
say that you right now are speaking RP, that's RP. But
I'm not speaking the way
if you are speaking RP now,
then that definition
RP
does
is
not
not
describe.
is not the accent of men who are educated at the great public schools of blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
So it's changed. It's not the same thing that it was.
No, not only on a phonetic level, but also on a categorical level. There are phonemic splits and things. I'm trying to think of an example. I think I vaguely had palatalization in mind, but I'm not sure if that's actually a phonemic thing now that I think about it.
Yeah, there are those sort of distributional things. In terms of the inventory, they're really
Probably pretty similar.
Yeah, they're very, very similar indeed. I mean, the closest thing you've got to a phonemic, it's a clear phonemic change, is the death of the cure vowel. And it, the simple truth is it's not totally dead yet. It's not as dead as, say, the force vowel, the or, which was present in the English pronouncing dictionary as recently as the late 70s.
I think that I've never heard anyone who has a traditional RP pronunciation of force,
yes.
but people who I would describe as Cockney or nearly Cockney, like my grandmother on my mum's side, will, like the classic only fools and horses during the war, they'll have something that sounds like it's got two syllables in the same way as we were talking about near earlier.
But you've got also there's a different kind of thing going on with phonetic environment. So you get people pronouncing some vowels with the schwa aufglide in final position, but not in closed syllables.
Yeah.
So you've got for, but bold or whatever it might be.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So could get that.
I'm trying to think what we were gonna touch on.
Yeah, there was something you were just talking about, and I was going to comment on it. I've forgotten. Anyway,
what was it? I can't remember what it was. I mentioned this in a video recently-ish. So you, just for viewers, you talk a bit about intonation in the book.
You did an intonation video.
I did.
Oh, I'm sorry for not having seen that one.
No, it was a while ago, and I did it very cautiously, knowing that my knowledge, understanding of intonation is very limited. But one thing I did, I think the main thing I focused on was the difference between what I consider to be an American way of asking yes/no questions versus what I think of as the British way of asking yes/no questions.
Yeah, okay.
Do you know where he went versus do you know where he went, kind of thing. Do you think that's a new? Does that seem to be in fact, now I think about it, having said that, I think I have seen your blog. I think you've done a blog.
The one about Meghan Markle. Meghan teaches us intonation. Yes, I did. Yeah, with loads of audio clips. It was about precisely that, where there was this thing in the media about Meghan now has a British accent. And
Right.
so some journalist got in touch with me and said, "Oh, can you comment on this? Is it true that she now
Can
has
you
a British
prove that she has a
accent?"
British accent?
It's amazing how people just won't trust their ears at all.
Yeah.
People say, "It's true, isn't it? The Queen's got a Cockney accent now, hasn't she?" And I say, "What, have you heard the Queen?"
Like,
But it's like, if you tell, you're an expert, if you
it's
tell
up
me
to
the
you.
Queen's Cockney, then she's Cockney, and I don't care what my ears tell me. No. Anyway,
she's technically Cockney because I don't know what the argument is. There's some slight phonetic differences from her early Christmas speeches.
oh
or
well,
something,
people,
meaning
yeah,
she's
people
now
do
Cockney.
this. People do this constantly. Where, I mean, an example of that is where people detect a slight accent, and they say, "Oh, it's got a very, very strong
Yeah.
X accent."
Yeah.
So people will exaggerate a lot in speech and language. And it was my belief. There may have been a few other little things, but I think what triggered people on Twitter saying, "Oh, she's got a British accent now," was her use of the fall rise
Yeah.
in a yes/no question, which is really not American.
Yeah.
And I think a kid was giving her a gift, and she said something like, "Oh, is that for us? Did you make that for me?" It was something like
She
that.
said that, okay.
And that's not American.
Yeah.
And you notice it when you go shopping. You get Americans say, "Do you have this in medium?"
Yeah.
And Brits say, "Have you got this in medium?"
Yeah.
So it's a kind of a polite, bright way of asking yes/no questions
Yeah.
in British English.
It does strike me as sort of a politeness thing. Like, it's almost. I mean, anything I say is going to be some impressionistic thing that's not got any basis in reality. But like, it sounds almost like an apologetic that you're asking. I don't know. That's anecdotal.
You mean like that British? Sorry.
Kind of, yeah. I suppose that's what it is. But
I think
no,
it's.
I regret saying that now.
Yeah, if I get a chance to do a second edition of the book, I'll modify what I said slightly, because I think I used to believe quite recently that the fall rise was maybe the normal way to ask yes/no questions in our kind of English. And I still definitely believe that it has displaced largely this da 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 da,
Yeah.
which is the old RP way of asking yes/no questions. But what I underestimated is just how often people use falling intonation, just simple, straightforward falling intonation with
Yeah.
WH questions. Because when I went digging around, when I wrote that blog article, I went digging around on Youglish, which we were talking about before, the youglish.com, just listening to loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of WH questions. And it hit me in a way it hadn't hit me when I wrote the book, just how incredibly common plain falling intonation is.
I think I sometimes hear falling intonation and feel like there's a rise at the end, but then, however many times I listen to it, there isn't actually one.
I mentioned that in the blog article as well.
Right.
The fact that that's really, really, there are so many cases where you think you've heard a full rise and you go and measure it and there's no rise there.
Yeah.
And I think some of that is to do with how far the fall falls. So
Okay.
a true fall goes down to the bottom of the pitch range.
Right.
Whereas if you hear this fall that doesn't go all the way to the bottom, we will
You feel like there's a
categorise
rise.
that as a fall rise.
Right.
And I mentioned that in the book, and that can sound very much like what they call vocative chant. This ding dong, they're like a doorbell.
Right.
Where people can say, however, that's a full rise, but you also get people saying, however, and that's like a kind of not fully
When
fully
they're kind of
executed.
unsure about things. sort of
Well,
thing.
no, I think it's just the variant. It's
Right.
just not as fully formed. But I think it's not just the only partly executed fall rise that is causing these falls in WH questions. I think there's just lots and lots of real falls in WH questions, and
Right.
it's to do with how open the question is. I think
Okay.
it's to do with the extent to which you already think you know the answer and
Right,
just want
okay.
confirmation. So it's the difference between I haven't got a clue what the answer might be. I'm curious.
Yeah.
Please give me some information about this,
Yeah.
where you're likely to use some kind of rise, and then I'm right, aren't I? That da da da
Yeah.
da da, and so
Looking
that's
for affirmation.
yeah. So we'd call that a question, but those are very often said with the fall.
Okay.
And I think it's more polite to be more open-minded.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
that's why the politeness thing comes in.
Yeah. That's a very good. That's a kind of analysis that I'd wanted to be able to make myself, but I was just sort of looking at it like, I feel like to me it felt like approaching phonology, or like what counts as the same phoneme for the first time, because I was looking at it thinking I have no idea how to analyse this without just sounding like a complete layperson kind of thing. So
Lack of well, I tell you what, that's an area where we would you were thinking, should we talk about intonation or pronunciation teaching? Well, there's a kind of overlap there to do with
Right.
people's lack of confidence in
In their own.
intonation. So people who teach pronunciation, often people come to us and they say, can you help me with my pronunciation? My weak point is intonation.
Right.
They tell you,
Right.
and it hardly ever is.
What, you
I've
think
hardly
it's
ever met
normally
anybody
infinity?
whose weak point was intonation. It's lack of confidence, and I think this comes down to this thing that I blogged about, where humans are visual animals, and people feel quite comfortable when they can see things, and so because there are phonetic symbols for vowels and consonants, and because there are dictionaries which tell you these are the symbols to use for this word,
Yeah.
this gives people what I would call a false sense of competence. It makes
Yeah,
people feel
yeah.
comfortable. And so if somebody's learned how to transcribe a word, they think, oh, okay, I've got the pronunciation of that word now,
Yeah.
which that's not true at all. Whereas in intonation, there are no dictionaries. There are ways of transcribing intonation, but they're nowhere near as widely known.
Yeah.
And you see, with segmentals, with consonants and vowels, you can, in terms of knowing how something has been pronounced, somebody can hear a word and then they think, okay, I've recognized that word,
Right.
and I've learned how to
I've
transcribe that
learnt
word.
what the symbols are.
Therefore,
already.
I heard how it was pronounced.
Yeah.
Now,
And-
people
yeah.
can't do that with intonation. With intonation, you've really got to listen.
Yeah.
Do you see what I
So
mean?
I do.
There's
So-
no word recognition, and there's no dictionary transcription. So this creates terror because people don't have those visual objects to hold on to.
Yeah.
They're very scared, and they say, "Oh, this is what you need to help me with."
Yeah.
And
because
what they're
they-
saying is, "This is what I'd feel uncomfortable and nervous about."
Yeah. Because I there's no way of getting whether it's false or
Well, they can't
There's no way
easily
of
write
getting-
it down.
yeah. Yeah.
You see, it's very, very easy for people to learn how to transcribe a word.
Yeah.
And you don't need ears to do this. You know,
How do
you know,
mean?
well, all you need to do is get a dictionary that's got phonetic transcription,
copy it.
and you
Yeah.
look at the
Yeah, I see
spelling,
what
and
you
you
mean.
can learn there's this other way of writing it. And
Yeah.
you don't even have to ever have
Ever
heard
said
the
it or
word.
heard it, yeah.
Yeah, you don't need a hearing system. You could be congenitally deaf, and you know you can learn to be a completely proficient transcriber of English without being able to hear anything.
Yeah.
And
That's true.
and so, and again, people have been very honest with me. I mean, I can remember being on one of my foreign trips, and somebody who was a university level teacher of English pronunciation and English phonetics, you know, said to me in a moment of candour, you know, I teach the Kit Fleece distinction, or the, you know, what some people call the short and long I, the E
Yeah.
distinction. She says, I teach it and I know which words contain them because I've learned the transcriptions of the words. But she said, you know, I can't really hear the difference.
Yeah. That's interesting. So
And, you know, I think, you know, she was just very honest. And I think that's extremely honest and self-aware.
Yeah, I think
And
that,
I think there are people around the world who are, fooling themselves and not equally aware, and they've learned how to transcribe words, but they can't hear the difference. This happens a lot.
I'm sure it's something I've done as well. Sort of learning. I've certainly learnt to transcribe things and pronounce the symbol wrong, um, but then that links back into the how narrow do phonemic transcriptions have to be and stuff. And if someone's learning pronunciation from phonemic transcriptions, to what extent are they going to get it wrong? Because because it's only a phonemic transcription and you shouldn't read it as a phonetic one, and B, because the symbols are out of date, or whatever. But
And really, listening is difficult. It's not easy.
no, it's not.
I mean, I'm constantly sort of shocked by my, deficiencies. One that always gets me is, the American court thing, whether or not you have different vowels, with this,
Yeah.
whether you only have R or whether you've got R and R as well.
Yeah.
And I listen to Americans, and I so often can't tell.
Well,
I can't. Is that R or is that R? I can't. I really find that one tricky.
I know people in their 20s who study linguistics at university, probably finished by now, but who have phonology and phonetics isn't the main thing they're interested in, but they have an interest in it, and I've heard them sit there going cock court, not being able to work out whether they have the distinction or not. And you could look at it sort of demographically and think, well, if you're not sure, then the chances are you probably don't make a distinction, because the statistics say that the kind of person that you are doesn't generally make that distinction, and you can't tell whether you do or not. But I don't know of anything.
And
from
the
my own
the physical pronunciations are often, they can be indeterminate. I mean, so I've always said tune and Tuesday and those things, and obviously more conservative tune Tuesday.
Yeah.
And so often I'll listen to see which speakers are doing what, but so often you've got something that's in the middle, and I think it's not just my lousy hearing and my lousy phonetic skills. I think it's just quite
it's
often
more
you just
spectral
can't tell
than-
which one it is,
Yeah.
Tune, what is it? Which one is it?
And it probably differs from one instance of them saying a word to the next slightly. I don't know.
And I think that I don't think that's a marginal phenomenon. I think that's everywhere.
No, not at all. Yeah, I've been trying to do I got a clip of an interview with Boris Johnson, and I went through in Pratt, the speech analysis software, and just it's best at it has this little thing where it tells you what it takes it's gone into sleep mode. That's what it must have done last time. It has this thing where it plots the formants for you, and sometimes it gets it a bit wrong.
Oh, often gets it, very
Yeah.
wrong.
But I found the ones it gets best are front unrounded vowels, because the formants are often further apart, so it doesn't get them confused with each other as much. And yeah, I've been going through trying to find what is the actual allophonic range of the kit vowel for Boris Johnson, what is the actual allophonic range of the dress vowel.
Oh, right,
and
okay.
stuff like
And
that.
what did you find?
I haven't I haven't found anything yet, but I was gonna see on the one hand how much do they overlap generally if you just plot them all F1 against F2 in a scatter plot. I'll try and show a preliminary thing on screen, but how much do they overlap generally if you just take all instances, and then how much do they overlap when you take into account environment and stuff like that.
Oh, okay.
And I think when you take into account environment, they're a lot more discrete. They're a lot more separate from each other.
Yeah.
Even in
you'd expect it.
situations where you wouldn't you would expect variation that was environmentally conditioned, but like, for example, nobody would transcribe the I in a word like lift differently to the I in a word like wilt, even though one is probably different to the other because there's labialization from the w and stuff like that.
Well, some people would too. Some people doing narrow transcription.
That's true. Yeah, but
I mean, there are
I don't
people
know
who
what I
do
was going
that.
Yeah.
I did loads of forensic work once, you know, and you're
What?
listening very,
Really?
listening very narrowly to.
What, like forensic work, like determining what kind of, are you allowed to talk about it? Or?
Oh, yeah. I'll have to kill you.
Just check with the audio. I think it will still be recording, but I just, yeah, it's still going. Karen, sorry.
Yeah, I try to come up with likelihood judgments of whether a suspect, you know, is the same is the same person as on a recording of somebody doing something they shouldn't do.
Right.
That's the usual kind of forensic work. People, they hear about this, they always think it seems terribly glamorous. You know, I must have got myself involved in car chases and and in fact, forensic work is some of the most boring work you can imagine.
Just sitting there at a computer.
Hours and hours and hours of boring conversations of you know, like Peter Cook and Dudley Moore conversations going for hours and hours and hours
Except
with no
without the humour.
jokes.
I like the idea, really. But yeah.
But it's incredibly educational because, I mean, that means, I mean, just thousands of hours of listening to real speech and trying to analyse it. And you read that, if nothing else, brings home to you the discrepancy between real speech and tidied up
How it's described.
phonemic transcription.
Yeah, I do wonder to what extent, because there are things like priming where a combination of not necessarily strictly adhered to features can produce a pretty good understanding. So for example, the fact that people can predict what word is coming next, even when, you know, based on various things, so that when they hear the word, if, say, the word was pronounced with slightly messed up phonetic realizations, they'd still obviously know what it was because they're predicting, they're expecting a certain word.
And it's a good job, you know, it's a good job we do that so that we can communicate. I mean, if our brains are constantly filling the gaps in to cope with planes going overhead and...
Yeah, but I wonder to what extent we allow ourselves to be lax in our pronunciation of certain phonemes, or we allow ourselves to collapse certain syllables and stuff like that, because obviously it's not a conscious decision thing, but how much of that is tolerable within the system of, at what point does that become uninterpretable? I suppose functional load's probably got something to do with it, but...
Yeah, and we were talking earlier about the difficulty of learning foreign languages. I mean, because when you're learning the language, you're not clued in. You know, you're not a member of the club yet. You can't. It's harder for you to handle that imprecision.
Yes, so you can't necessarily understand somebody talking as well because you're not used to what kinds of syllables is it okay to collapse and not really pronounce very distinctly, or what kinds of allophonic variation
Yeah, and it could
should
be,
you expect
and it's
to hear
not necessarily going to be the same.
from
It's
person
Anna
to person.
Karenina. It's, you know, it's all happy families are alike.
Yeah.
Each unhappy family is unhappy after its own fashion. So you've got these different ways of being messy, of being sloppy.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah.
You have to learn what kinds of in order to sound like a native speaker. I think you need to learn where is it acceptable to do such and such, because I won't say this confidently. I was going to say nobody will ever teach you that. Maybe, I don't know whether you would teach that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, think about, might be going off topic, but think about word linking, which is something I'm very, very interested in, and where I think the usual phonetic descriptions aren't very helpful.
Right.
And well, I could go on and on about this. I don't know how much time we've got left, but I think there's a lot to be said about this. But if you look at your conventional books on English phonetics, you'll usually find a chapter called Connected Speech Processes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this chapter is usually how to do a certain kind of transcription exercise. It only
Right.
teaches you modifications that you need to make in order to get a good mark in a connected, so-called connected phonemic transcription exercise.
Right.
So that if like good boy, this kind of thing,
Good boy, yeah.
where you have to notice that the teacher, that the dictator in the exam has said good boy. So,
Rather
I
than
noticed
good
that
boy,
one.
yeah.
So you have to write down with a B instead of a D. So this kind of thing gets taught in the traditional connected speech processes chapter.
Yeah.
But what doesn't get taught is, how to say is the to the same degree. Is the where which is one of the most common things you've got to do, where you have so many words in English end in z, is, was, does, has, etc.
Yeah.
And the is the most common word in the language, not to mention that, this, these, those, etc.
Yeah.
So in English you're constantly having to go from z to th.
And how you do that on a mechanical
this is not
level,
trivial at all. I mean, yeah, you could. There are shortcuts, but there's also the non-shortcut way of saying it. Now, how much time does the typical traditional English phonetic course or book spend on z? Well, generally none whatsoever.
None at all. Yeah.
And I think this is because you don't have to do anything in your phonemic transcription. I mean, there is a shortcut where you could assimilate. You can totally assimilate. You can say, "Is this?" So that's a change you can make.
without pronouncing.
Well, you can totally assimilate the second. So like saying, "Is this? Is this? Is this?" Like, how's that in cricket?
Yeah.
But okay, so that's a modification. But what I'm talking about is not taking the shortcut, just saying, is that right? That's very difficult and needs a lot of teaching.
Yeah.
And it's not covered. And I think in the standard textbook transcription, you write is and then a space and then the space doesn't exist in real life.
No, in connected speech.
But that kind of connected speech isn't covered in the connected speech processes chapter. If you see what I mean.
I do. I wonder if... Sorry.
That's not exactly the right example of what we were talking about, because there you've got... That's because English has different phonotactics from most other languages. Most other languages don't have a final z and an initial the. Yeah. However, even where you've got similar phonotactics, languages don't necessarily get from A to B in the same way.
No.
So maybe a better example would have been to talk about where one word ends in a vowel and the next word starts in a vowel. Now, clearly, different languages have different ways of doing that. So English, English tends to keep the two keeps the two syllables intact with some kind of consonantal thing that separates them. Could be a glottal stop, could be some glide or other. Some people, could be an inserted glide, could be a glide that's kind of on the end of the first vowel. But then you get languages like Italian and Spanish etc., or Russian, where the vowels can just blur into each other much more.
Like when I was trying to learn Spanish, because a lot of my friends in first year at university ended up being Spanish. One of the big things I kind of noticed for myself, without learning it from any book, although I'm sure there are books that describe it, was how it deals with hiatus, and how sometimes, if one word ends in a vowel, the next starts with a vowel. The first vowel in that sequence can either just be dropped off completely, or it can form a diphthong with the other vowel, or it's just a completely different approach to hiatus.
And in running conversational Spanish, the synalith or I don't know how to pronounce it even. Syneresis. I never know how to pronounce those words. But
syneresis.
Syneresis. I think if in normal running Spanish, it's absolutely used all the time.
Yeah.
And makes it very difficult for me to hear where
understand
the words are. So that's a great example of where the shortcuts taken by different languages they're just not the same.
Yeah, and it's a thing in...
It's very rare in English. Extraordinary. There you go. That's a good one. That's an example, a rare example of it in English. Extraordinary, where you lose the first vowel.
Like I was trying with German.
Of course, then you can have extraordinary.
But when I was trying to learn German at the same kind of time. I started a bit earlier, but one thing that I carried over, because standard German is I don't know whether it would be described as such, but it's kind of non-rhotic in the same way that standard southeastern British English is.
Yeah.
And I found myself doing linking R in German, and then people said, why have you said r at the end of that? And I said, well, that's how it works, that's how you talk. And I realised that German normally deals with that, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but normally deals with that just by having a glottal stop.
Absolutely.
So
yeah.
even in the middle of a word, so like the word
However,
yeah, when they're speaking English, like in the middle of a word like erinnern, which is to remind.
Yeah, miteinander.
Miteinander, yeah.
All those things, yeah.
It's
So that gets carried across, not just inside of it, like however, which you hear from Germans, but also things, collocations, or things that would really go together in English, like each other.
Yeah, it sounds like that, because it sounds like the hard attack of RP, traditional RP. It maybe that's part of the reason people think German sounds so abrupt, because glottal stop is used for hiatus resolution a lot more than it is in English.
Yeah, massively
Whereas,
more.
Obviously, from the perspective of a German speaker, that's just how you talk.
I think it's getting more common in English.
I agree. I think I agree. Like, a thing that's kind of related to that is the fact that the whole thing about the definite article being the before vowels and the before consonants. So I've noticed more and more people, even myself in some situations, saying the apple rather than the apple.
That what you're doing that now, are you?
I'm starting to, I think.
Yeah.
I'd have to.
I'm very conservative on that one. I mean, sorry, it sounds like I'm I'm very conservative. I wouldn't do that kind of thing if I were you. No. I mean,
I'm
I
fine
just.
with, but that I will not put up with.
Yeah, my native accent's extraordinarily progressive in all kinds of ways. Just happens to be. I mean, very like Tuesday and things like that. But in some ways, my accent, my idiolect, is conservative, and one of those ways is the lack of glottal hiatus resolution, or whatever you want to call it, the hard attack.
Yeah.
I'm a big linker.
Yeah, I think I was when I was a child. I think it's probably from listening to YouTube videos and things that I've started. I think it probably depends who I'm talking to as well. I'd still think of myself as using the apple, the onion, but I've caught myself doing the apple, the onion sometimes.
If you go to, I mean, it's not that we're talking about that, some speakers being in the vanguard, like with vocal fry and things like that. And you can see this increase in hard attack, following this demographic and regional path as well. So, I mean, if you go on YouTube and go to, say, some explanatory video about an American video explaining how to do something, like with Facebook or Google, or explaining something techie, where the voice artist is a young woman, maybe California or something like that, and it's that explanatory type of speech, how you do something, some app or something like that. You masses and masses and masses of hard attack.
Yeah, I've heard it in podcasts actually, probably of people from.
But the same
area.
speaker, if you listen to that same speaker then having a conversation, there won't be as much.
This is part of the thing I was thinking about. I did a video about how we think about the past, which I think you said you have a similar perspective on, thinking about the granular detail of the past and everything. But
fascinating.
One of the things I thought about was how, if somebody in 40 or 50 or 60 years' time wanted to look back and think about how things were on an everyday level, in everyday conversation now, would they have any issue, given that people film all of their lives and stuff? And I thought, because vlogging and podcasting has a particular style, but I never thought about it in terms of phonetics. I'd always thought about it in terms of, the explanation, intonation and stuff like that. It's not how you talk to somebody in actual conversation. I think I'm trying to come to think of it, I'm trying to think whether I'm talking to you on camera the same way as I'd talk to you off camera. I think I'm probably not.
Almost certainly not, but probably not a big difference.
Probably not a big difference, no.
Yeah, but yes, even with this endless documentation of everything now, it's still it's still curated.
Yeah, it is.
It's curated one way or another.
And people don't think about it that way. It's like when I think about the difference between... It's a slightly different thing, but when I think about the difference between Vulgar Latin and Classical Latin, that may have been... I think that, they're... it won't be the exact same thing, but in the same way as we think about academic English and conversational English, like when I was trying to learn German a bit more than I am now, I thought, I'll read a novel in German, and every time there's something I don't understand, I'll look it up, and then by the end of the book I'll be better at German. Nobody would speak that way. It's just various aspects of it. And I realised, well, they're doing the exact same thing as English speakers do when they write novels, in terms of there are conventions for, descriptive conventions for prose and stuff like that, but it just hit me that this is not how anyone speaks, and this isn't how a textbook on speech would teach you to speak. This isn't a very good way of learning German, other than formal grammatical constructions and stuff like that. I don't know where
reminds
that came
me
from.
of,
Sorry, I just got off on a tangent there.
One thing I find kind of interesting is if you're ever channel hopping on do you watch TV anymore?
A little bit, yeah.
I hardly do. But I always remember noticing how you sometimes channel hop, and you stay on a channel for about a quarter of a second before you go, I don't want that one, go on to the next one.
Yeah.
And it suddenly hit me how almost always in a fraction of a second you knew whether it was fiction or not.
Yes, that's a good point.
Now it's not just the speech; it's
There'll
because
be
it's
something to do with
because
the camera
it's to
angles
do
and
with
stuff as well.
framing, it's to do with
Yeah.
lighting and everything. In fact, that's a large part of it.
I think even if you just had the audio,
if you only got the speech, you
you'd
can
still
hear
be
the
able to
difference
tell.
between fictional speech and real speech.
Yeah, you can. It's all conventional, even if certain conventions are supposed to mirror actual speech. I wonder how well a completely naturalistic a film done completely naturalistically, such that all the conversations had things that weren't relevant to the plot, had people tripping over their words, had people aborting a sentence halfway through and rephrasing it. How well that would go down, or if people would watch it and say, this is, shit, this is boring, I don't know. I don't want to watch
it's
this.
it's not like you can't find any of that. I mean, there's, especially in comedy, there's kind of improvisational.
Like Derek and Clive.
Well, yeah, this is it. And even more polished, whatever you want to call it, shows have. There are shows that are much more naturalistic. I mean, different.
Yeah, there are. Yeah.
The Office is a famous
That's
example,
true,
which
yeah.
was kind of following on from. What was it? Larry Sanders, the American,
I'm not sure.
Gary Shandling. That's all very.
I don't
Was
know.
unusually, unprecedentedly kind of. It's good stuff. You have a look at it.
I will. I'll look it up.
And then Ken Loach. Do you know Ken Loach's films?
Yeah, we looked that up when we were trying to recreate a 1960s conversation. We thought that's supposed to be socially realistic.
But obviously, I know you kind of sort of rant against this as if it's a sort of failing, but obviously art does tidy the world up.
Of course,
does distill
yeah.
life.
I don't think there's anything wrong with having conventions or anything like that.
On the other
I
hand,
don't
you
think
do
there's
get
anything
people
wrong
who
with it.
think they're being realistic and they're not. And
They're not, yeah.
I always, and does it really having tried script writing myself? It
I
really
was
does
gonna
strike
say,
me when
have you written? I checked your Wikipedia page to check that I didn't get anything, miss anything like the honorifics thing. I think I called you Mr. Lindsay in my first email rather than Dr. Lindsay. But have you written EastEnders? Is it EastEnders?
yeah, it's true.
Bill? Wow, that's quite a.
It is. It's a quite
thing to put on
weird,
your
isn't
CV.
it? It's quite odd.
It's an interesting combination of things to have done, but it's multiple
I
strings
had a
to
very,
bow
very,
kind of situation.
very bizarre career. I mean, sort of self-inflictedly, I suppose.
Was-
EastEnders is a funny one because, you know, a certain section of the population is like awestruck to hear that, and another section of the population is totally indifferent,
Right.
and then another section of the population views you with complete contempt.
I wonder why there is that difference. Do you think that it corresponds to people who have watched EastEnders versus people who haven't watched it?
Yeah, I mean,
Like people who haven't watched it.
Yeah, there
think,
are people who are
there's
fans
millions
of it,
episodes of EastEnders, you know.
yeah, I think, yeah, there's fans, there's people who don't give a damn, and there's people who really, really look down their noses
Yeah.
at things like soap operas.
Well, soap operas is probably an example of where convention is perfectly. Well, I mean, any convention I think is fine and should be treated descriptively as this is just a convention, and this is, as long as people don't look at this and think this is realistic, then
Well,
that's how stories are told. Like
I
you
mean,
say, that's
the great British soaps, Corrie and EastEnders, they're from the point of view of what we were just talking about. I mean, they're really interesting because they're in some ways totally artificial, and in other ways they're a lot more realistic than other dramas. I mean, because life just goes on. It doesn't get, you know, life
Yeah.
just keeps going on and on and on and on.
whereas otherwise it would be contained within.
It isn't
this
packaged,
This is
yeah.
the plot, and then after the plot,
Yeah,
the world.
that's very naturalistic. And then, of course, the first one, the first telly one, Coronation Street, was absolutely realistic kitchens. I think it comes out of that early 60s working class realism,
Yeah,
you know, so that's,
more. Yeah,
you know, relatively speaking, compared with, say, the classic American, the American, I don't mean the big budget ones, I mean the American daytime soaps that never get shown
right.
here.
In the UK.
I mean, they are, you know, hilariously stylized and not realistic in any way
Yeah.
whatsoever. I mean, it's not more like kabuki or something.
Yeah.
But so the EastEnders and Coronation Street have got high degrees of realism in a way.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if you were channel hopping, you still wouldn't. You wouldn't think
might
you'd
tell.
stumbled on a documentary.
I suppose mockumentaries are probably where that naturalism in terms of speech start, like the Ruttles and Spinal Tap and stuff. Where
Yeah.
in an interview, obviously they're going for an actual documentary thing. So in an interview where somebody's not anticipating the questions and they respond without a script.
Yeah.
If that's what you're going for, then you're going to
It's
act.
kind of interesting. I don't think I'd actually thought about this in any depth. Unless I've got the facts wrong, it's kind of interesting that the improv would be more in comedy.
Yeah.
In fact, improv itself is it's a comedy genre.
Yeah, that's what I.
You know, people don't say, "Oh, I'm going to go to an improv club to look at heavy improvised
Improv
drama."
Yeah, I think that would be a very
Shakespearean
interesting
improv.
thing. Like, well, I suppose that would be. I don't know why, because it would be just as doable. Going on the assumption, possibly wrongly, that most improvised comedy.
Somebody must have thought this all through.
I'm sure. Yeah.
I mean, I just think if you think about mocking people, making fun of people. I mean, there's entertainment value, humour value
Yeah.
in doing a close copy of a close imitation of something.
There
Often
is,
with exaggeration, but
exaggeration in the right places.
I've
so that
always absolutely loved impressionists. You know, really good because
Yeah.
they're like jazz phoneticians.
John Coleshaw. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a good way of describing it.
And oh God, just always.
Convincing ones.
Yeah,
It's very
and the thing is, what
entertaining to
really
watch.
gets that burst of joy from an audience is when somebody nails something
Yeah.
and nobody else has previously.
Yeah. What, like as in an impression or
In
something?
an impression, when somebody just gets somebody, it's the recognition rather than the artificiality bit.
Yeah.
And so there's something in that that triggers the laughter response.
Yeah. What, you think it's... I suppose...
I'm trying to think about why this verisimilitude
cluster,
would be related to humour rather than...
I suppose it is just the cluster of things that trigger the laughter response aren't necessarily as related to each other as we probably think they are. Maybe there's some level on which well, something that we laugh at is funny, therefore all of these things are funny. But if you actually looked at the details of it, you'd realise that maybe funny isn't an actual clade. It's just the only thing that characterises it is that you laugh in response to it. But I think it may be getting to the point of me having to zap off, which is
Zap away.
which is a great shame, because
Thank you
I've
for having
very,
me.
very, very much enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah,
I'd
me
be
too.
up for further conversation at some point,
I hope so.
and I will not. I'll try to organise things on a day when I haven't got an evening plan booked, so that we don't have that restriction.
And maybe it's
But-
warmer.
Yes, yeah.
I'm
well,
just
sure
hoping.
it'll-
I'm just hoping I don't look as though I'm trembling too much.
I don't
in the
think you
video.
look like. I think I was trembling at one point, but I think getting some delicious.
Well, cut that
coffee
bit out,
might
and people will think it's just with excitement.
Yeah. I'll edit the coffee out of frame.
Great. Thank you.
I think we've probably got a couple of hours there. That's very good. If you like, I can send you the